consuming modern REST APIs. I've been working in APIs for about 5 years. I always start my talks with talking about prompt. This is a conversation about mental health in tech. In technology, you're really in your own head a lot, and that's a real draw for a lot of people that may have mental issues or mental health issues. And for me, it was a real big problem for several years. I've been good for about 10 years. And being healthy is really the way to go. But you need to be aware that you might run into people in our field that may have issues, whether they be small or big. It doesn't matter, but there's never a good time to talk about mental health. So you have to make that time. This is me. TomHAnderson.com is my website. I wrote a HUD for the last Starfighter on the Commodore 128. My first PHP website I wrote in 1999, and it's still running. I'll brag about it for a second. E-Tree pioneered the standards for distributing lossless audio online. So before MP3s, we were transferring entire concerts, bit-for-bit copies, zipped up using a tool called Shorten, and later FLAC. So FLAC, we were the first customer for FLAC. And we had 300 FTP sites and about 30,000 users, and the numbers didn't crunch. So we were the first customer for BitTorrent. For the first 3 years that BitTorrent was around, they were, our BitTorrent tracker was the only link from the official FAQ. I'm a PHP guy. I've done JavaScript. You'll see how good I am at that. And I've been using Zen Framework 2 since Beta 1 and Doctrine 2 since 2011. I was a contributor to AppAgility when it was first released. AppAgility is an API engine. It allows you to write your data into the engine and not have to worry about all the rest of the stuff that goes on in building an API. I'm a member of the Doctrine team. Doctrine is the most complicated object relational mapper in PHP. There's no good way to say it, because I would say best. But the team is very active and made up of the best programmers in the field of PHP that I know. And I wrote the Doctrine and AppAgility integration. My company is API Skeletons. We build object relational mapping-based APIs at Richardson Maturity Model Level 3 with hypertext as the engine of application state. Entity relationship diagram centric, consistent contributions to open source. I have about 100 repositories on my personal GitHub, and I've contributed to all of them. APISkeletons.com. Okay, so APIs, all applications should expose their API. That's just the way it is, and this is why. Jeff Bezos in 2002 sent a memo out to the whole company that said, every service we have has to be accessible through essentially an API. He called them a service interface. And Amazon now is completely API-based for everything across the entire company. And he said right here, you get fired if you don't do this. So now we're going to get into HTTP, Hypertext Transportation Protocol. This is the basis of the web. You have to know this stuff if you're going to be a web developer. So when you're browsing the web, most of the time you're doing GET requests. Sometimes you might submit a form, you'll do a POST request. There's other requests. You can do a patch, a put, and a delete. I'm going to go through all of these. The GET gives you a URL only with no payload. A POST allows a payload. The payload can be formatted in different ways. In AppAgility, we use JSON as the payload. In most web forms, it uses www.url form encoded header for that. A patch will update a resource. So if you like, what we're going to be working here with is JSON. And a resource is defined with JSON. If you want to change something within a resource, you issue a patch statement. If you want to replace the entire resource, you issue a put. And that is really rarely used. It's not common at all. But some people, like, the difference between patch and put is often confused. And just know that put will replace the entire resource. And then delete also has no payload because you specify the ID of the resource, and it will delete that resource if you have those permissions. A little epitaph here. SOAP, it was XML based. It was from like 2001, 2002, and every call used a post to the same endpoint. So you would have a command, and you would have data parameters for the command, and they would go to the same endpoint on the server. And that's how SOAP worked. If you see SOAP in a job description, run the other way. All right, that's my opinion. JSON. So here's a JSON object. Very, very straightforward, basic. Is this really enough information to build an application with? If you're getting this kind of data back from your API, you could be doing better. API resources break that, what SOAP did with a single resource into multiple resources. And at the basic level, they all also use post. And but they break the work down by resource, user, artist, album in this case. And that helps to organize the API. Resource collections and entities. A GET collection would be a URL to a host with a resource name, might be user. You'd get a collection of users back. GET entity would return an entity or a JSON object with the identifier for that resource, which might be a user ID. So user/1 will give you user 1's information. The post collection post acts on a collection and will create a new entity. You actually could post to a resource, to an identifier, but I don't know what that's supposed to do. So post is generally collections. Patch and put, you can do this on a collection and it will change everything in the collection. That's a possibility if you want to do that. Patch and put also specify resource name identifiers, and that's the more general way to work with that. Delete needs a resource name identifier, but you can also do it for a collection and delete the whole collection. These 5 verbs are core to HTTP. And when you get into working with an API, you're going to work with all of them, except put. All right, so now we're going to talk about APIs. The Richardson maturity model defines what an API is, how mature an API is based on the way it's structured. Level 0, this is where SOAP comes in. That's a swamp of pox. You don't want to go there. Okay, level 1 is resources. This is what I showed you with the resources that might all have the same post command. Level 2, HTTP verbs. That's where you start using the verbs on the resources. So you're acting on entities and collections inside a resource using those verbs. So now you've got it broken up. If you wanted to compare this to SQL, it's like insert, update, delete for get, post, patch, and delete. Okay? And then level 3 is hypermedia controls. Hypermedia controls is what I said at the beginning, the hypertext as the engine of application state. So along with everything else you get back in your API, it includes HTTP links. So your application, for instance, pagination links, will be returned from the API, and you never need to know where your user is in the pagination. You just use those pagination URLs that it returns as part of the request to build your page and your page navigation. As I told you, I work with app agility. This is a Richardson maturity model level 3. We do RESTful and RPC services. A RESTful service would be something that uses all those verbs and is against a particular data point, for instance, a user. An RPC service would do work. So I was working on one of those today that merges 2 entities together. And I needed to make, it couldn't be called the same entity that stores the relationship that should be merged. I needed something that actually do the merge. So I created an RPC for that. JSON is part of app agility, and this is specifically HAL. HAL is hypertext application language. This is a dialect of JSON. There's several dialects out there. HAL's pretty good. The authentication available with it includes HTTP Basic and Digest that are very boring, and OAuth 2, which is pretty cool. OAuth 2 is the standard for APIs authentication now. It's a little complicated, so make sure you're using a library that knows what it's doing. I wrote one. Problem details for HTTP APIs. That is, it's an API problem response that gives you a link to the standard in W3 that is causing the problem that you're receiving. For instance, if you get a 401, then you don't have authorization, and it will have a link to the standard for that, the RFC. Versioning is versioning the entire, well, not, I shouldn't say entire. Versioning is versioning of resources on an API, so you can they can progress past the initial application. And oftentimes, if you're going to do that, you need to support all the versions going backwards. This is built into App Agility. I've never seen a good case where it's been used, but it's there, and it's as it should be. Documentation, HTML Swagger. I don't know what Swagger is, but somebody said that my stuff looks like Swagger, so we'll get to that. Okay, hypertext application language. At a minimum, this exposes a self-link for a canonical representation of the data. So with every resource you get back, within every entity, it's going to include a link to the canonical name for that. So if you fetch user/1, you get user/1 back, and included it has a link that says user/1. And if you get a collection, you have the individual links for all the users in the collection. It may include embedded data. Embedded data is also a HAL resource. I'll show you examples of embedded data, so I'll skip an explanation now. Collections include pagination links. So what I said before, you don't need to know what it is. It also includes count, total, and page in the collections, and that's all built into the response by default. Okay, so that's my slides. In order to cater to the least common denominator, I graciously wrote this in Angular 1. So this is an application that I wrote on top of an API that I'm building. This API is my db.etree.org data. I restructured the entire database through migration so it's repeatable, and have been building this API on it. It's a 3-year project for me at this point. And it has a full correction of invalid UTF-8 data built into it, and it's a real work of love. This is not something I make money off of, because of the db.etree has live concerts. So Grateful Dead, Fish, Dave Matthews, Widespread Panic, String Cheese Incident, and their taping policies say you can't make money if you help facilitate the trading of our music. That affects me and one other guy. So I'm going to pull up the app first. Here it is. And I'll click on artists. And we get an abbreviation, and we get the name. They're not ordered. You can click on this little filter. This is kind of neat. I created this as a module, or probably another name for it, in Angular. That I wrote, and that will sort the collection. We're getting about 25 back here at a time, and that's fine with the pagination for now. Now you'll see my pagination links are broke here, but we'll look at those in raw form and see what that looks like. Now if we go to performances, we also get the artist name back. Now these are coming by ID, so let's put a year of 1996 and see if anybody played music after Jerry died. Whoops. And here we got a lot of fish. Fish is ID number 4 in the database, so we're getting that back because we're ordering it this way. If we wanted to look, say, by venue name, then we'll get some other data in here. The way that I'm doing these filtering at the top is interesting. It's kind of a challenge. It's a challenge for a lot of people to create a way to filter data in a way that is safe to do on the database and really flexible and easy for the user. And in order to do that, I had to create a whole library which uses 3 parts per query minimum. That is, it'll have a field, a value, and an action. So it would be field name equals 1. And using those 3 parts, you can do all of this. Equals, not equals, less than or equals to, greater than or equal to, like, not null, and not null. And that's as much power as I can give to a user, almost. It's actually possible to do inner joins if you know the schema of the database through JSON, through JavaScript calls. So this is that schema. I'm not sure how to zoom. So here you can see the artist, and the artist has an alias. The artist has a group, and there's a many-to-many relationship there, and the artist has a link. There's an artist to performance link. You can see that up. Okay, it's buried, but it's there. There's corrections for performances. There's performance groups and performance links. Now, that gives you a pretty good understanding of what we're looking at with at least this set of the data. And how quickly I explain that is just incredible to me. This is an entity relationship diagram. And this is what I build my APIs with. I start with this. I export it to XML. My object relational mapper reads the XML, creates the database, and creates my entities. And then AppAgility comes in, reads the entities, and creates the resources. The documentation here, let's get back and look at what these responses look like. This is a response for an artist. Here we have the pagination information, and we have the total page count, the current page size, total number of items. That all just comes back with the request. Here we have the artists. Legion and Mary is a big fan of that project. And it has artist link here, which is empty. Has under embedded, the user who created it, the last user who edited it, the artist group that it's a part of, and I can open that, and it gives me a link. Now, I don't want to pull down this whole artist group every time. So instead, I create a link to the collection, and it even includes the pagination, like I explained. I mean, the filtering, like I explained. And this one's not going to work. Sorry about that. Let's go back to performance. Now this performance call has the pagination, of course. And for each performance in here, under the embedded data, it has the artist as well. And then all that information on the artist. And in the way I program this, this is all conglomerated, is that the right word? Into the response at the same time. So I don't need to manually go in and do this. It already understands all this because of the relationships that are in the entity relationship diagram. So how do you use this? In my search here, let's look for state, Utah. It's a year, 1995. And here we have fish at the Delta Center on 6/8. I didn't know they were there. I missed that show. But I was at this Grateful Dead show. Actually, the one on the 21st. There were 3 of them there. So the layout that we see here, we get the name, we get the dates, we get the venues, we get the state, all that jazz. And that's coming back in through this template, this JavaScript. So on the load or on the init, it calls the load. And every time you do a search, it calls the load. And that just does a call using a get method using HTTP. Now, I didn't get into this HTTP clients because every language has their own HTTP clients. I figure you all know that. This is of course Angular version 1 client, and it gets the URL, which has the search string in it, and then puts into scope the data. So we're straight response data back into scope. So that comes to this template where we iterate through that, and we have one function here which redirects the performance to like the full detail for the performance. And when it puts the performance ID, it uses this JavaScript object just like a JavaScript object, performance embedded artist name. And you can, yes?
Sorry for the quick question. These, when you are making the call, what kind of data are you consuming? JSON, Python, XML? What kind of data is?
So the response for this, yeah, it looks like this. I think it was performance search. No, that's not it. Search performance. I'm going to rename that. Okay, so here's a search for dead, and this is exactly what we're getting back in the Angular. Yeah. So we get back the links array, we get back the embedded performance.
So it looks like a JSON.
It is JSON. Perfect. Yeah, the whole thing is JSON. Something that I'm just a little aside here. It's possible to modify this response. So you can use computed fields. So if I wanted to for the artist, if I wanted to include the total number of performances for that artist, I could run that as the artist was rendered and have it here as computed data. So we're not just limited to this kind of response. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so now as a JavaScript developer, and for myself as an API developer, you're my client. I need to make sure that you're happy all the time. It's not your job to make me do stuff that I don't want to do. I need to make you happy. So this is the documentation. Okay, for the artist, we have a get post, we have a get on an entity, patch and delete on entities, and this is the permission that you need for each of those actions. Let's look at post. Here's all the fields that you can send, what's required to send. Here's the request, example of a request, as well as the accept headers for the request, and the content type that you should send me, as this body is what you're sending in the post. The response that you're going to get back, here's a list of the HTTP codes. Notice 200 is not here because it's a post, so you're going to get a 201. Again, content type headers, and then an example of what the response might look like. And I provide that for every possible call in the API.
Did you write that all out yourself, or do you have some sort of tool to auto-generate some of it?
Yes and yes. The configuration for app agility is done through a UI, and you can enter the documentation in there. For what we're seeing here with these colors and having the permissions, that's all stuff I did myself. So in the first line of all my documentation, I do a JavaScript object that says permission source. And then I parse that at the time I render this, because this is dynamic that we're looking at. Then for the APIs I produce, it's all built around these entity relationship diagrams. And with this, you can actually create inner joins on your queries. So where we had the one here, like artist group, and we had artist equals 3. And forgive me for these. I did send in a bug request, and they did fix it, but they left it like that. But it works even though it looks like that. So you can add as many filters here as you want. I'm going to jump through is there interest in filters? Okay, I'll jump through those real quick here. It looks like this, and this is pretty basic. This is a jQuery here. It gives a URL, what type of request you're making, and then filters. For the data, it's the filter. And we can say here a cycle between 1 and 100 or a cycle greater than 1,000. You can't do that with 99% of the APIs that are out there. They don't have that flexibility. Here? That's the call for Ajax in jQuery as a generic way of doing it. You can also call .get. If you call .get, you don't need to include this, and you don't include the object. You include the URL, and then you include the object. You can query relations. You can query many-to-many relationships to see if you've got something as a member of. And then here's the values for equals, not equals, less than, and so on. Down here we have between, which is really powerful, especially if you're working with dates. Yes?
Are you familiar with the data spec at all?
The which one?
Oh, data spec?
I'm not familiar, only by name.
It's like one of the SQL parameters in the URL.
Only by name.
It has some of the similar EQ for equals.
A lot of these came as a combination of Mongo naming and Query Builder. Query Builder is part of Doctrine. So it was a combination of those two. I think that Doctrine came from Mongo, and I came from Doctrine. So.
What about linked SQL? Do you mess with that at all?
Linked SQL?
Yeah.
What does that mean, linked?
What? Linked SQL? Is it link? Yeah, L-I-N-Q. Yeah. Did you just say it's dead? Yeah. Okay. Link is different than dead. The syntax, there used to be two syntaxes for link. There was the SQL syntax, and then there was the method syntax. And it also looks a little bit like that. I just wondered if there's any correlation.
No.
Okay.
Just it kind of comes from Mongo around the horn. So we have is member of, and we had andex and orex. These are really powerful. I just used this the other day to, in a similar way, to get security where a user exists or the artist doesn't have any security for the user. You can do orex, and then you can order by any field. And is member of field somewhere in here is the inner join. Oh, you can send the format of your date fields as part of the query. So here I'm saying format is year, month, day. So depending on what my value is, I can send it the format, and it'll automatically be parsed on the API side. Okay. Here's the inner join. When you inner join a field, it works through the way the ERD is. So here I have an artist-to-artist alias, and those are the names here. So if I'm on an artist, I can join the artist alias table to it.
So I don't mean to slow you down. It's just a little fast for me, probably everybody else is probably right on. was that a database model? Is that what
It's called an entity relationship diagram.
Okay.
And it's a little bit like a database model, but I can export this to XML. And then the XML can be consumed by the object relational mapper. And that can automatically generate all my entities. And it automatically generates my database with complete referential integrity.
So it does work a little bit like a DBM.
I showed this before before I started talking here, and we dumped one that had changed, and it came back with, if I run, it did a delta of the existing database versus the metadata, which is in the XML, and came back saying I need to create this unique index.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What created you ERD?
It's called Skipper, and if you talk to them, tell them I sent you. I like those guys a lot.
Probably heard of Erwin.
Is that for Java?
Oh, no, I think it was a ERD.
I'm PHP, and this supports PHP and it supports Doctrine, and so that's what works for me. I haven't worked with any other object relational mappers. Back to here. All right. I think that's it. Can I have questions? Yes.
I have two questions. Very similar. It's not 100% on the topic, but it's on this topic. Basically, I saw that you were using at moments you were using like some sort of JavaScript, but you also were working with XML. So two questions.
Actually, there was no XML in what I showed up here. There was when I showed you here.
Yeah.
But that was the metadata for Doctrine, but it was not related to the API directly.
Okay. So, well, I'm going to ask a question, but maybe there is no answer. What is your favorite tool that you use to convert data between XML to any JavaScript? It could be JSON or Bison or a plain JavaScript object.
I'm just a PHP programmer.
So you do it using PHP?
Yeah.
Just with the PHP row with 100, what did you say again?
Oh, 100 that I've contributed to.
Just.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of fun being an open source. This is my website, and this is all the tools I use and their relationships to each other.
You said someone had passed away.
Barbara Bush.
Barbara Bush? Oh,
Yes.
I know that. Thank you.
So here's some of the tools I use. Doctrine has 2 million downloads. Appagility has 687,000. Doctrine and Appagility, which I wrote myself, I mean with help, but I was lead on this one, has 182,000. The OAuth 2 Doctrine adapter has 68, which I really like because that means half the people that download it also use this. And this is OAuth 2 as a entity relationship diagram, and supports everything about OAuth 2. And then the scopes are off on the right side.
Have you ever worked with JWTs?
Yes, I had to in order to create the unit tests, and I like them. I mean, they have a really good place. And I've had clients that come in saying, "Well, maybe I should use a JWT," and I put it pretty far down my list before I point in that direction. But if you have a server that needs to make API calls, and you can't time them out, then JWT is the way to go.
So JWT is for everybody, I guess.
It's for server-to-server communication where there's nobody involved.
I'm sorry. So there's a payload in the middle, and then there's the key at the beginning and at the end. Right, the header, and then that.
There's a subject.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
What I'm trying to say is, so in our current project that we're working on, we have exactly what you're talking about, a bunch of API calls. We send out, I guess, a token is what we're currently using, just a randomly generated token, and then we get it back. But the problem is that we have this long conglomerated JSON object that we're having to serialize after the fact. Whereas with JWT, you just pass in the claim domains that you want to get back.
And you can use the JWT as the authorization, or I'm sorry, as the access token.
Exactly. So that's what I was wondering. All right. Maybe we can talk after.
Sure.
Great.
Anybody else? All right. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here. I was told this afternoon, and I've never attended one of these. So